Hello, everyone. Good evening to you on this lovely Wednesday. And my name is Kevin. Happy to have you with us as always. If you've been to one of our workshops before, then you kind of know the drill. This is about an hour, and our goal is always to try to provide some sort of insight to candidates that are going through mostly the advanced studying process, although we have other candidates that we work with who are going through some residency applications and interviews and stuff like that as well, which we help. But a lot of you many of you are in the advanced studying process. So our goal is to always to put out free information to help the community, help people who just don't know where to begin sometimes, or are pretty close to making it and just need a little bit of a nudge. And that's where a workshop like tonight's is going to come into handy, hopefully for those of you who have upcoming interviews. And that's really why I wanted to do this, because I know I've heard from a lot of the folks that we work with that they have upcoming interviews up on the horizon. And I thought it would be useful to put out some good information on that. And to discuss a topic that I don't really think I've given my full attention to before. I, of course, have done numerous workshops, and if you're on our email list, you probably have seen some of the recent replays with regard to interviews, and you'll probably hear some of what I am going to say tonight. You may have heard that in another workshop in little bits and pieces, because there's a lot of overlap with interview topics. But this one I really wanted to do more of a deep dive into, and that's all about storytelling. And I find that this is one of the more challenging topics that candidates that we work with have, is to they get that they need to tell the story, they get that they need to have examples, but they don't know really how to go about that. So this is why I thought this would be a great topic for tonight. Before we get too far in, I always like to do a check to see if anyone's having any problems hearing me, seeing me, any of that stuff. So I will keep an eye on the chat room, which is on our website at internationaldevcentral.com/workshop. Some of you might actually be on the YouTube, and if you want to if you're on the YouTube page itself and you want to be involved in the chat, just to let you know that we check the chat on the website, which is again internationaldevcentral.com/workshop. But of course, you can watch it wherever you want. Maybe for some of you, you're on your mobile phone, so it's easier to see it on the YouTube app, right? So anyway, we're going to get into the topic tonight. I want to just put a few things out there, which are, let's see, questions. We always have a number of questions that come up during these workshops. And if you have a question that comes to you either before we get started or during, while I'm talking, I say something that makes you like think, oh, wait, I have a question about that. Please feel free to add that into the member chat box. It's called member chat on the page, but basically put it in the chat box, and I will make sure to go back to the beginning and start checking questions when we get to the question segment of the interview workshop. So if you have a question right now, you can throw that in there. Doesn't mean that I'll be able to answer it yet, but at least it's in there, and you'll be one of the first ones to have your question answered. There are times where, just because we run out of time, I'm not able to get to all the questions. So I would say if you have a question that you really want answered, throw it in there early versus later. That said, if it's a question that's really not related to the topic tonight, that will have to come as like a second priority, not first priority. So the first priority will be the questions that I can easily see are pretty related to the topic, and then the other questions that are more general, I'll try my best to answer it if we have time. I don't think I need this right now, so I'm going to take that off. Okay, great. So what I'd like to do is just say hi to everybody. First of all, I'm looking at the chat box. Yulia has joined us. Anna has joined us. And of course, there's a lot of folks who have joined us, but just saying, these are some of the folks saying hi. Thanks. And hi back to Anna, Yulia, Alicia. Really happy to have all you guys here tonight. And being part of the community, being part of the IDC community at least. When you come to our workshops, we consider you part of the gang. Of course, some people take it further and they sign up with us as clients, and that's great. But I want you to know that we really welcome everybody, and we're really happy to have everybody who join us. And I think there's a great spirit of just knowledge sharing. This is stuff that, in terms of even the interview workshops that we give and the interview coaching that we give, a lot of this is stuff that we've learned from clients and candidates that we've worked with over the years. They've told us about their interview experiences and what it was like and what some of the challenges they felt and dealt with were during their interviews. That's so helpful to us. So it's a two-way street often. It's us learning from you guys and us hopefully being able to give information back to you. And the nice thing about it is often, because people come to us and we're sort of in the middle of a lot of the community information back and forth, we're able to take what people tell us and kind of like reshare it in an anonymous way, of course, but reshare it in a way that's helpful to the community. So if we hear about schools going a different direction, changing things in their interview, changing things with their bench test process or their application process, we're able to, again, share that out to folks and help people so that they can be a little more adaptable, right? What I want to do right now is go into some slides. So you're not going to see me right now for a little bit, but again, I'm going to go through this and then we're going to have some time for some questions afterwards, so make sure to stay tuned for that. So let me just switch my screen over right now, and you won't see me for a little bit, but that's okay. You'll see the slides, which is great. And again, if you have any trouble hearing me or such, just let me know so I can make sure to adjust that, and I'll again keep an eye on the chat. Great. Okay. So power of stories, as I mentioned, this is something that I feel very strongly about, is having great stories in your interview. It's pretty much, to me, vital for any effective interview performance. You have to have great stories. And I have bombed interviews, especially at the beginning of my career with everything. I bombed interviews because I didn't have good stories. I didn't know what to say. And so I'm really passionate about making sure that people don't make that same mistake. I want people to be ready, be thoughtful about the stories they're crafting and creating, and making sure that they have really thought about this beforehand. So as you're always going to hear from me, it's all about preparation when it comes to interview success. My name is Kevin Marshall, as I mentioned. If you haven't been to any of our workshops, I focus on the interview side of helping candidates here at IDC, whereas Dr. Alyssa, you may have heard of Dr. Alyssa, she focuses more on just both the application side, application consulting, and general candidacy consulting, though I do that a little bit as well. But also she really focuses on the bench test and the practical side of preparation. So people will love her feedback and her guidance, and together I think it's been nice, because I've been someone who's done interviewing for over a decade now. I would say, actually, yeah, over a decade now I've been involved in interviewing, and not from a person who was just an interviewee, someone who was a candidate, but also from somebody who interviewed now thousands of people in universities, and that includes students and staff and professors, all the way to the corporate Fortune 100 companies that I used to work for. So been a hiring manager, also been somebody who made selections and was on selection committees for student positions, student seats, all that kind of stuff at university. So together, Dr. Alyssa and I, we are a good team, and our goal is really help people get in. We've had a lot of success doing that. We had a lot of great success stories of helping people get into dental school in the U.S. And that's really why we enjoy this. We just enjoy the work, so it's fun and very rewarding. This is an old slide. I should have taken that out. Don't pay attention to that one. All right, let's get into this topic though about stories. What are some of the interview questions that require stories? And I'm just going to go through a few of them. You know, you're going to come across a lot of different types, but some of the more common ones are, oh, excuse me, no, back here. Okay. Questions that you're going to get in your interview that require stories. Tell us about a time when you dealt with a difficult situation. This is a very common one. Tell us about a time when you made a mistake. Tell us about a time when you had a lot on your plate, yet you managed to get everything done on time, or you had a lot going on, a lot of deadlines, a lot of maybe some tests coming up, and you were able to succeed with everything and complete everything that you needed to. I'm looking at the chat right now, and I see Anandita mentioning that having trouble seeing the video. Let me know if anyone else is having that trouble. Just, I imagine I'll start to get more of those messages in the chat box, but please do. And for Anandita, I would recommend refreshing the page first, and if not, you can click on the YouTube video. There's a video, right? And so if you click on the title, the power of stories and how to captivate, you can see that. If you click on that actual title, you'll be taken to the YouTube site itself. That might help you, and especially if you're in a mobile phone, that would probably help you. So try that, see if it helps. Okay, so the other one, tell us about a time when you dealt with a conflict. So these are issues these are questions that you're likely to get in your interview that are begging for, or basically they're directly asking for you to tell them a story. Now because now it's second nature to me. I've done this for so long. For a while, I was always confused when I would hear a candidate, if I was in a mock interview with them, let's say, and I would hear a candidate sort of give me a general story, but I never felt like they were answering the story. And I was always like, what is going on? And I realized that a lot of times it's just not second nature for us, and we're not thinking about stories and the structure of them very much in our day-to-day life. When we tell stories to maybe our friends or family, there's a lot of context that they already know, right? So let's say you're talking to your partner, your spouse, and you say, yeah, Johnny came up to me today and he yelled at me for this, or he got mad at me for that, da, da, da. And I told him. And so you go into story mode with your significant other or your family members. They know a lot about your life already. They know who Johnny is. You probably talked about him before. They know where you work. They know what year this is, what day it is, all this. There's a lot of context that they already know. And so it's not necessary to give them all this information. And so a lot of times candidates go into the interview situation and they make the mistake of assuming that the interviewers have this sense of context that they know about their life. And so they don't always do a great job providing that context, that background. That's one problem. And so a lot of people just don't really think about how to structure a story correctly. The way, if any of you were have been exposed to, I don't know, maybe drama or something in school, you'll have encountered scripts, right? And so what is a script, especially if it's like a play? A script gives so much background information about what should be happening at what time and who everybody is and all this stuff. And those who are in the industry of Hollywood, let's say, or Bollywood or any kind of movie industry, who their job is they're writers, right? They're screenwriters. They are experts in story creation, story formation. And none of us really have that background. So unless you're working in that industry, we're all sort of at a disadvantage because we're not used to creating stories. We're used to consuming stories, right? We get on Netflix and we get on YouTube and we just watch maybe series and dramas and all this stuff, and we consume a lot of stories, but we don't really think about what some of the patterns are with story creation. So that's why I wanted to address this tonight. Now, why do interviewers ask questions that it requires stories? Well, there's a few reasons. One is, um, like in the situation, like a difficult situation, if they ask you about that, they want to hear how you behave with challenging or difficult situations. Again, most of the time you're going to be talking about something difficult or challenging. Otherwise, it's not really a good story. Um, Problems that you've solved, and this is all based on your previous positions, previous experiences. They want to test how you react. What's your typical way of reacting to an issue, a problem? How stressed out do you get? Do you let it overwhelm you? Do you freak out? Or do you handle it professionally and calmly? Also, they want to test your problem solving abilities. And in that sense, you could also say they want to test how intelligent you are, how smart you are, also how creative you are, right? So, how creative is this person to solve problems? Do they think outside the box, or do they solve problems in the most limited way and create maybe even more problems by by their attempt to solve problems? And finally, your level of responsibility. How much responsibility do you take? How much initiative do you take trying to solve a problem? Are you somebody who, when you see and encounter a problem, will start asking yourself what to do and thinking of different options? Or do you try to push the problem away? Because these are very important qualities that not only will affect you and your performance in dental school, especially in a clinical environment, but of course down the road after dental school and you're working in, some of you have already often worked before, but many of you will be having a long career after dental school in the US. And so it's really about trying to ascertain like what kind of dentist are you going to be, and how successful you're going to be when issues come up. So what's your job as an interviewee, as a candidate? What's your job? Well, a couple things. Number one, you need to know the elements that make a good story. And thankfully, we're going to talk about that right after this. So you need to know what those are, because if you don't know what those are, you're not going to be able to remember, um, or even structure a great story. It's going to be a flat story, which is a lot of times what I get from candidates initially. It's just a flat story that doesn't really answer what I'm asking and is unexciting, maybe off topic, all that stuff. So what are the elements of a good story? Also, knowing the difference between an interesting story and a boring story. Now, you may know what the structure of a good story is. You may know, you may be able to check off elements of a story. And so you kind of meet the criteria in that way, but it doesn't mean that you've told an interesting story. It still could be a pretty boring story. So interesting is vital, and I talk a lot about interesting throughout the Interview Mastery course that we have here, and also through these workshops. I talk a lot about being interesting because there's so much competition in this um, overall, let's say, community of advanced studying applicants. So much competition, and residents even more, that you need to stand out in a positive way. And one little easy way of doing that is to become more interesting as a candidate. The more boring you are, or the more boring you appear, I should say, because a lot of people can be actually very fascinating people, but when they're in an interview situation, they don't present that interesting aspect of themselves, or just kind of they come across flat. If you can showcase yourself as more interesting, the better. And one way to do that is through interesting stories. Also, decide which stories you're going to use for which types of questions. Not every story that you have is going to fit every question, right? So I talked about some questions right here. I'll go back a little bit. These are the questions that they usually ask that are related to stories, right? And you're going to want to have an appropriate story ready to go for each of these types of questions. So that's important. And I actually left out one, which is ethical, on here. So tell us about a time when you had to make an ethical decision that was difficult, or that you tell us about an ethical situation that you had. So that's another one. Just so you are going to want to have different stories for different situations, different questions. For the most part. Now, there's a little bit of overlap, which means that sometimes you, especially if you don't have one ready to go, you can take one of the other stories you prepared and sort of like twist it and shift it into a story that works for another question. But you have to make sure that it's it's a good candidate for that. All right, so the last thing is strategically craft your stories before your interview. This is where, like I mentioned, I made the biggest mistakes in my interview. This is where I bombed interviews because I thought, oh, I can remember my past. I'll just show up to the interview, and whenever they ask me a question, like this, I'll just try to remember and tell them the story. Well, I tried that. The story came out choppy. It took me forever to remember what the story was first. It didn't contain the elements of a good story. I left out vital information. It wasn't interesting. It was a terrible story at the end of the day. And so why does that not work? Because I tried to do it in the moment. I tried to do it on the spot. And so those of you who are like, yeah, well, I don't know how to do it on the spot. I'm not sure how to answer questions on the spot. Well, neither am I. Neither is anyone really. I mean, very few of us are really good at that. We have to practice this stuff beforehand. Just like you wouldn't show up to your bench test unpracticed. Well, some people do, I guess, but not advised. Just like you would probably better not to show up to, a very complex patient case without some sort of treatment plan that to show up, I should say, to treat without a treatment plan. That's why treatment plans are recommended. So there's patterns of preparation all throughout professionalism, and this is one of them. So prepare ahead of time. Now let's talk about the elements of what makes a good story. Now I took this directly from guides for screenwriters. So it just shows you how pertinent this is to interview stories. There's such a strong connection between the two. So if I were to write a movie, let's say I want to write the next Marvel blockbuster, well, I'm going to probably look at this outline first before I get started with my screenplay or my script, because I'm going to want to remember that I want to check all the boxes. First, I need a protagonist. That's a hero. Then I need an antagonist. What kind of story, what kind of movie, like an action movie, doesn't have a villain or an antagonist? Or if it's not a person, it could be a problem. It could be there's some movies about, a meteor coming to hit the earth or something, right? Well, that's still the antagonist. It's still the villain. The antagonist is the person or thing that is threatening all the good of normal good stuff, normal good life activity. Then there's an inciting action. Something happens, so we have these characters, but nothing has happened yet. The inciting action kind of starts, it's sort of like the first pushing of the first domino, right? First domino, then that makes all the rest of the dominoes fall. So there's an initial action that creates the momentum of the story. Then there's the conflict action, and this is the way I would characterize this is your response. This is the action you're going to take to solve the problem. So there's that conflict of you solving the problem. You could say going to battle with the problem. And then there's the resolution. What's the result of your actions? And so it's pretty straightforward, right? So you can see this, and if you think of any good movie you've seen, has all these elements involved, woven throughout. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to meet both the protagonist and antagonist in the first part. You might meet the antagonist later, etc. But you have them here and there. Now, if we get into how do we apply the story arc, this is called a story arc, what I just told you. How do we apply this to an interview story? Here you are in an interview. Some of this, how does that translate? Well, the protagonist is probably always going to be you. What's the point of telling an interview story or a story in an interview where the hero isn't you? And you might think this is common sense and like, why are you even making a point of this, Kevin? Isn't that obvious? Well, actually, I've heard candidates make the hero other people before. Well, what's the point of that, right? You're the one being interviewed. You're the one being evaluated. And the reason that candidates sometimes do this is because they are modest people. They've grown up, we've all grown up in a way to be somewhat modest and to not try to take too much credit, even when credit is due. And so a lot of times I'll hear about oh, well, we dealt with this problem in my office, and you know, here's the issue, here's the concern or the conflict, and then I brought it up to maybe someone like my professor, or I brought it up to my boss, and I'm so grateful because they solved the problem for me. Well, in that story, that he was the hero. The boss, your boss was the hero, or the professor was the hero, not you. Or maybe the team was the hero. All of us decided to do this, and we did that, and that worked out really well. So that, again, that protagonist becomes a little unclear, or it's the wrong person. So you want to make sure you're clear about who the hero is. You're the hero. Make no mistake about it. And if it's true that it wasn't, if the real story wasn't that you were the hero, maybe the team made the decision. Well, you need to emphasize your role to make yourself more of a hero in that story. You may need to shift that story a little bit. Who's the antagonist, or what's the antagonist? So the antagonist, I put rarely ever a person. That's not always true. There are certainly cases where it can be a person, but we don't want to vilify. So I put villain. We don't want to vilify anyone, even if they have, even if it's a person who is sort of acting like a jerk, or causing problems. We rarely even want. It's not professional to vilify. So I don't want you to get hung up on trying to, oh, I gotta, and then this jerk came in and he was he said this and that, and we got rid of him. We want to be careful when we talk about the antagonist, that we do so with respect and understanding, or we try to make the antagonist sort of like a force. Maybe it's bad luck. Maybe it's a complicated case. So instead of you fighting a person, you're fighting a really complicated, difficult case, and your action is to do the best treatment you can, and the result is success, right? So in that case, the antagonist is just a really complex situation. It could be it could be in other external forces, like I said. It could just be I've had a candidate talk about a flood that hit the city that he was working in as a dentist, and cost money, of course. Patients couldn't come. So in that case, the antagonist is the flood, right? And so think about who the antagonist is. You have to decide that. Inciting action, as I mentioned, what's the action that kind of gets things started? Well, it could be a customer who came in and started complaining. It could be a coworker that coworker, yeah, they're the antagonist, but what did they do? So we want to think about what's the action that they're taking. Coworker says something inappropriate to a patient, or causes some other kind of conflict. A manager makes a decision. So the decision is that inciting action. Causes problems. And again, the unexpected event. So even if the antagonist is the flood, well, what about the flood? The flood happens, and then here's what the flood starts to do. The flood, we thought the flood was not going to come to our area, but it did. Now we talk about the conflict or action. This is you getting specific about what you did to solve the problem. What did you do? And you're getting into that. You're starting to explain the way I looked at the problem, I evaluated, I analyzed first, and then I came up with a solution. I talked to maybe a few people, and I went through. And then finally, the resolution. Always include a resolution. This is a lot of times where candidates drop the ball. They talk about what they did, but they don't showcase a successful resolution. They don't showcase what positive thing happened because of their smart action or intelligent action. So that's how we apply this to an interview story. Now, out there, if you've done any kind of internet research on interviewing, you'll come across something called the STAR method. This is very popular out there. It's sort of like an easy acronym to remember. But when you're in an interview, the theory is that you're in the interview and you think, oh, okay, they want a story. What's the STAR method? And then you're supposed to think situation, task, action, result. Well, I'll tell you one thing. I've tried this before in interviews, and things are so fast, and I always seem to forget what the T is. I'm always like, oh, what's the T? And so the STAR method has not been immensely helpful to me in an actual interview, though if I prepare ahead of time, it can be useful. But I still don't love the STAR method, and the reason I don't love it is because of the word situation and tasks. And I'll explain why those kind of bother me. For the first thing is, situation is a very unemotional word. It doesn't, situation could be that maybe there's an error in your in your accounting books, and the error doesn't really have any major consequences. It just gets overlooked, and it really doesn't, it's not like an error that's going to cause major problems. So a situation isn't necessarily good or bad. It can be good, it could be bad, it could be neutral, right? Situation is often neutral. So there's lots of examples where a situation isn't necessarily a problem. And that's why I don't like the word situation. I actually want you to be thinking about a problem. I want you to actually be thinking of this as, what is the crisis? And so I like the term CAR instead of STAR, because I want you to think about problems, not just situations. Situation can be just, you had a drink of water. That could be a situation. It's not a big problem. Probably more than not, when people use the word, they probably mean more problem focused. But again, it's just not strong enough for me. So again, I like to think a little more dramatically in the sense, because I want to push people to think more problem focused and think more dramatically, and to create, because that's going to create a better story. A task. Well, a task doesn't always fit when you're doing dental work. I mean, yes, the task is to do a treatment, but I think a lot of times the STAR method is used in business, and so they think more like, what's your task that you've been assigned and stuff like that. Well, you've not been assigned tasks, and usually in dentistry, you have a problem, you have an action, and you have a result, with a lot of stories. And so I don't find the word task that helpful here. I think it almost is a bit distracting. So we think about CAR method, and we just think, what's the crisis or conflict? What was the action that I decided to take? And what was the result? And also 3 is a little easier to remember than 4, just simple. So that's the way I would approach this. If you're not sure what to do, make sure it passes that test. Make sure you actually have a crisis. And you know what? Yeah, I'm using that word a little more dramatically, the word crisis. Not everything is, of course, a real crisis, but, think about an issue where, you don't have a tool on hand, right? And it's the one tool you need to complete this treatment, and you can't find it. Well, okay, is that a crisis? No, it's not like a national crisis, but it is a mini crisis. And it could cause a lot of problems in the treatment if you never find that tool, or it could just delay things, and it could throw off your entire schedule for the day and force another patient to have to come back the next day. So it causes a lot of problems, and that's a crisis in a way. It's a mini crisis. So think about things in terms of what they are in terms of a crisis. If not, then a conflict. It could also be just an interpersonal kind of situation. Then action, what is the result you took, and then the result. So I'm sorry, what's the action is what's the action you took, and then the results. So let's get into an actual example. I think that's the easiest thing to do. And so we're going to take a question. We're going to discuss how to think about the question, how to create, what should we be thinking about when we're deciding our story and crafting our story? What are some kind of do's and don'ts? Question, tell me about a time where you dealt with a difficult situation. So again, a lot of you are going to get a question like this in your interviews. We've talked about alternatives at the beginning. Another way of doing this, of course, would be, tell me about a time when you dealt with a conflict. Tell me about a time when you made a mistake. I think those are the 3 most common. Now, do's, and these do's usually apply to most of those questions. Do's, choose a good story. We've already talked about that. I'm not going to say it again, but choose a good story. The second one, show how the problem or the crisis could have big consequences, or could have had big consequences if it was left unchecked. So again, with that tool, if nobody found the tool that you needed, or the instrument, then if I didn't, in the story, you're actually kind of laying it out for them. If I didn't find the instrument soon, what would have happened was, I would have had to ask that would have had to maybe do it some sort of temporary, and because I started the treatment already, and I would have had to have the patient come back, the next day. I would have reorganized my schedule. It could have obviously it was going to affect 2 or 3 other patients that day. So we're creating a sense of like, yikes, this is a bad situation. So you need to justify that in your story, whatever that is. Then showcase yourself as the hero. Now this can, for some stories it's obvious because you're the only one there anyway. But if you're in a team or you're part of a larger, class or cohort, or just a team of staff, then you want to showcase yourself as a leader, at least as somebody who's contributing something significant to fixing this problem. So if you are dealt as a team with an issue and you're all discussing what to do, then you might want to say something like, and then I came up with the idea of, or I had the idea to, I discussed it with my team. They all thought it was a great idea. So here's me solving or coming up with a solution for the problem. Heroic. I'm not just standing on the side waiting for somebody else to do it. I'm showing leadership there. Or another way to show yourself as a hero is when you see a problem that's not even your responsibility and you solve it anyway, right? So if you think about what do we talk about, like that concept of everyday hero. Somebody breaks down on the side of the road. Hundreds of people pass on the freeway. They don't even bother caring. But that one person stops, gets out, and helps them make a call to their tow truck to get a tow truck, or maybe they help fix the tire. That's an everyday hero. Or maybe someone's in an accident and they stop and they check to see if the person's okay. They call 911 when everybody else is driving past, ignoring the situation. So the hero is like, I don't have to do something, but I'm going to do something anyway. So that's another way to make yourself a big hero is maybe the problem isn't inherently yours anyway. Maybe it's just something that you notice in the office or in the class or at a dental camp, and you step up and say, hey, somebody needs to deal with this. I'm going to deal with this. And that is even more heroic than just if the problem was assigned to you or you just came on your fell on your lap, basically. You're going to discuss the solution to the problem, as I mentioned, in detail, what it was, why you came up with that, why you thought it would be a good idea, and what the plan of attack. Then finally, as we mentioned, you want to discuss that positive feedback. Now, when I say this, I actually want to kind of be clear. It's great if you can discuss what people said. Maybe it was a boss that noticed that you had solved this problem. They didn't even know there was a problem before. And then suddenly you're solving that problem and they come up to you after and they say, hey, you did an amazing job. I didn't even know I didn't know that was even happening. You handled it perfectly. Thank you. Well, that's positive feedback, and you're kind of quoting them in your response, which is giving kind of a sense of proof that other people approved of your solution and they were grateful for it and that you were a hero for it. What don't you want to do in these questions? Well, one of the biggest mistakes, as we've talked about, is when people elevate the problem to somebody else. So let's say they have the problem that comes up for them, and then their response is, I'm going to tell my supervising dentist about this. I don't know what to do. And so I called my mentor, or I called the supervisor, and they dealt with the problem. Or I didn't know what to do, so I called the professor, and they solved the problem for me. Manager, same idea. Now, I want to say one caveat of there are times where it is protocol and it is actually the right thing to do to discuss the issue with a supervisor or a professor. I'm not telling you that you should always take initiative and just solve the problem. There are times where you could actually get in more trouble by doing that, not less. So it depends on what your role is. If you're a student or a junior dentist and you decide to start solving problems that come up without really checking with authority figures, and then mistakes happen, well, now you're in a worse situation, right? Or it just shows that you don't follow protocol. So what I would always recommend is if you're in a situation where you're a student or a junior, this is not your office, you can do both though. You can say, hey, supervisor, here's the situation and here's my suggestion for how to solve the problem. Then you can still showcase yourself as a hero, or at least as someone who is a creative problem solver, and say, I told my boss, they thought that was a great idea and they gave me the go ahead. Now we've satisfied the fact that you didn't just go rogue on them and take things into your own hands. You checked with authority first and you still had a great idea. Everything's checking out great, right? So make sure that you're including that in your story if you think it's appropriate. So again, if you're at a student clinic or something at the dental school, you're not going to just, let me just do it on my own. You're going to talk to the professor, and the professor is going to like to hear that too. They're going to want to be, okay, good. He or she checked with us or checked with that professor. Don't solve the problem adversarially. So sometimes this happens where, you deal with a difficult patient or difficult person, and maybe it's very clear from the story that patient or person was wrong. They're totally wrong. Well, it's still not appropriate to say, we threw her out on the street and or we just kicked her out of there and told her never to come back, and she got what she deserved. And you're kind of discussing the story as if you were kind of more aggressive about it. It's a little less professional, and you took it personally too. It's not very attractive, right? So always be careful. You don't want to show that you are adversarially taking care of the issue. It's like saying that, a guy came up to me and I didn't like what he had to say, so I punched him. Like, so that would not be a good thing to say in an interview, right? What's better is like, we talked about it, we resolved our issues, we negotiated. So this is the more civilized approach. Finally, don't say that you've never come across a difficult problem like this. Another big mistake that sometimes I see candidates make is that they don't have one, and they're like, well, I want to be honest. I've been always told, just be honest. Just be yourself in an interview. And I've never had a problem a difficult problem that I can think of, so no, I don't have one. Well, guess what? You failed that question. Failed. That's going to be a problem on your interview. And you might be able to get away with one or two of probably one of those during your interview. But if that becomes a pattern and you just don't have answers for these questions, you are going to fail the interview. And they might smile at you, and they might shake your hand and really thank you for coming and give you the impression it all went well, but you probably failed. So no interviewer likes to hear, I don't know, or that never happened to me as a response. You can probably find something if you're creative enough, and if you work hard enough, you can always find some situation. Even if it's not perfect, it's better than nothing. So always try to find something. So let's look at the situation. I'm going to read the situation actually. And just so you have an idea, and I thought these clip art, this stock photo. I love stock photos. Sometimes it can be very funny and very dramatic, right? So during my time as a general associate dentist, I had a patient come into my office with her child. She was completely belligerent and demanded treatment be performed on her child. Now, this is, again, I've been asked this question. Tell me about a time where you dealt with a difficult situation, and I'm the candidate. And I'm bringing up the story. I'm giving out sort of right now, laying down the background. So what am I doing? I'm telling what was my role, and it's kind of getting clear that I'm going to be the hero here, but not absolute. The antagonist in the situation is a patient coming into my office, completely belligerent and demanding treatment. Now, it doesn't mean that she's the villain herself, but the situation is at least antagonistic. It's a problem that I have to deal with. After realizing that the problem was due to the child's braces, which our office was not involved in placing and installing, and after explaining that she would have to visit her child orthodontist instead, the mother went off the deep end and went after my colleague, who was the one who diagnosed her child, as well as the assistant, the dental assistant, and the manager. She was yelling, screaming, and cussing. So that's the situation. I've laid that out. I've laid out the background story. I've also laid out that in kind of that action that starts everything, the inciting action, which is that she's screaming at people. So now the story is in play. Now we get to the conflict action part where I'm going to start to come into the scene as the hero and solve this problem. Now, again, I'm not the one who diagnosed her daughter or did any sort of treatment on her daughter yet. I'm just coming across this situation because maybe I'm the owner of this facility or the office. So I'm going to say after the situation, the first thing I did before entering the operatory was to review her daughter's radiographs, discuss the case in detail, and also in private with the dentist that had first examined her daughter. After discussing and then concluding that my colleague was correct about their diagnosis, that this had to be the case, that it was related to the braces, I went into the operatory and introduced myself as the head dentist of the office. And I explained to her, and I asked her to explain the situation to me. So I'm going in there. I'm not going to go in there and start telling her the result of my investigation. I'm going to first let her have a few minutes to tell me, what she's frustrated about. During this time, I looked the mother in the eye, and I remained silent to make sure she knew I was listening to everything she was saying. And I did so in an extremely calm manner. So I'm making sure that she knows I'm listening, I'm acting calm, and I'm showing her respect. After she was finished explaining, I told her I completely understood her frustration and I could relate to how she felt, so I'm having empathy there for her. Next, I asked if I could quickly examine her daughter. Again, I've already seen the radiographs, I've already seen the patient case, and so she agreed to let me do so. Again, I'm basically just confirming that my colleague who had diagnosed her originally was correct, and I come quickly to that conclusion again. Want to make sure I'm covering all the details, not leaving anything out. I'm seeing the situation for myself, so all that's good. I explained the facts, which were that the pain her daughter was experiencing was indeed due to the braces. I also let her know that we don't have the capacity here to solve this problem. We're not orthodontists, but we can help her find a local hospital, because maybe it's a Friday night, maybe it's after hours, a local hospital with access to an orthodontic resident on duty who might be able to help resolve this issue very quickly. Once she heard my suggestion, she immediately calmed down and started to ask me questions about the plan. We were able to provide her with information about where to go and which hospital we recommended that would probably be able to help resolve this issue as quickly as time as possible. And once she got that information, she thanked me for being so helpful in resolving her daughter's pain or trying to help resolve her daughter's pain. She walked out of her office completely in a different mood than when she walked in, and felt confident about the next steps. So that's me as the candidate describing the situation. I've gone through, I've calmed the patient down by listening. I've listened to everything she had to say. I kind of reaffirmed my suspicions, doing a quick examination myself, agreed with my colleague, and then I found a solution for her. But I also explained the facts that we can't do it here, but here's a solution that might work. And by providing that, she was able to be calm and all was well. And so that's an example of that story. You can see that there's that hero, I'm the hero. There's the antagonist, which is partly her and maybe partly just a bad situation with her child that her child's going through. There's the action that starts it, which is her walking in and screaming at everybody. There's the action that I took and the response that I took to solve the problem and the different ways. I went into detail about how I did that, making sure I covered all my bases. And then there's the results. She was grateful. She was thankful. She expressed thanks to me. So all is well. So we feel good about this story. And that is a typical example of covering all the bases, making sure we are providing a story that's right what they're asking for. It's interesting. It's there's a crisis involved. There's pain. There's cursing. It's of course, in terms of dentistry stories, I'd say it's a pretty exciting story. Of course, then when you compare it to maybe other stories, when you compare it to an action movie, maybe not. But that's not the point. It's a good story. It's good enough. And so that's the way we approach these these questions, we get them on the interview, but we want to have made sure we've written all this down, maybe outlined it beforehand, so that when we go into the interview, we're ready to give all the parts appropriately in the right order. Okay, so that's the idea. I don't have too much time to go into any other ones, but this is a great kind of format that you can use and bring into any question. Just follow along and make sure you have all those boxes checked. So we're going to get into some questions that you guys are asking, and if you do have a question about what I've said and you just kind of got a little late, make sure you write your question in the chat box so I can answer it at the end. We are going to have a few minutes for questions. I want to quickly chat about something we always talk about here, which is how we help candidates that are going into an interview. They have an interview coming up, or they expect to this year. There's a lot of folks that we work with. They just know they're going to have some interviews. They want to take advantage of the time they have before the interview comes up to prepare, and I really encourage that for folks that have that time and luxury to be able to do that. So we offer something called the Interview Mastery course. The nice thing about it is that once you join, you have access to it for as long as you need, as long as it takes for you to get accepted and into a program. And so this course, it's very complete, comprehensive. It's over 16 hours of content. Video content, and it really goes over the fundamentals. It goes over things like similar to what I just talked about, stories and how best to discuss stories. It talks about aspects of how interviews really work, not just what we think interviews are, strategies for commonly asked questions like the ones I just talked about, and how to handle difficult interview personalities. That's always challenging. How do you deal with the ones that are trying to throw you off track? Also, of course, how to differentiate yourself from other candidates, how to stand out in an extremely competitive process, such as the advanced name process. And also how to differentiate yourself. I'm sorry, I just said it. How to personalize things, different questions with a section we have called How Do I Respond, which is basically all these types of scenarios that you might encounter in your interview. We give you personalized kind of way of thinking about the best strategy for that. Not only with the course, but also with our sessions, which come with most of our plans. So we also, these are the fundamental modules that we have. Welcome to of course, there's about the course, the fundamentals of interviewing, confidence, and how to build confidence, U.S. culture, and your interview. That's always important for folks that have interviewed in other countries or just never interviewed before, and they kind of want to get an idea for just not only U.S. culture, but U.S. academic culture and understanding that. And then finally, differentiating yourself, and of course, that section, How Do I Respond, which really covers a lot of miscellaneous topics. Those of you who like the course and you feel it's valuable can always upgrade to get other sessions, or you can just sign up for all of it at once. And for those who take part in the well-prepared level or higher, you'll have access to a 1-hour pre-mock interview strategy session, and you'll have access to a 2-hour mock interview session. And these are really powerful. So 3 hours at least of coaching sessions, and there's other ways to get even more if you want. But this is really what I would say is one of the things that we learned early on was that the pre-mock interview session really helped people because we helped to strategize and give that personalized guidance for specific questions and often the most important questions that you're going to get on your interview. It was very powerful. And so we give you a full recording of that. And then we also do a 2-hour mock interview. All of the folks that we work with, that we have working with candidates here, are fantastic. They have lots of interview experience out in the field, in academia, et cetera. And so that 2-hour mock interview is a full kind of recreated mock interview session. It's a recreation of what you're going to get in your interview. We go over the questions that you're likely to receive on your interview, depending on the school that you're going to. So your interview will be different if you let us know you're going to Colorado than if you let us know you're going to UCLA or something. You're going to get a slightly different interview set of questions. Of course, there's always some questions that are in each one that are common, but there's a lot that are different. And so we provide that experience for you, and then we give you again a full recording so that you can see for yourself, where you need to improve and what you need to do. Also, that comes with feedback. Of course, in that session, we're going to give you feedback right then and there about what we would recommend changing, both about your the way you're presenting yourself, words, energy, dress, attire, but also the specific things you're saying. What can we actually change about your responses itself? And maybe we give you ideas for completely different ways of responding. Like often I will say, that's just not going to work. You need a different weakness. Strengths and weaknesses. That weakness is not a good one. Find a different one. So that's not uncommon. So that's the interview mastery in a nutshell. Again, overall, you're going to be really prepared for your upcoming interview. And if you join us for the bench test prep, which is bench test mastery, you're going to be prepared for that as well. You can learn more about interview mastery. Underneath this video, there's a green button called Get Interview Mastery. And so check it out. I think a lot of you guys will find it to be interesting if you are planning to prepare for your upcoming interview, which I hope you will. All right, so questions. Thank you guys for throwing some of the questions in there. I really appreciate the participation. I'm really excited by that. And let me do my best to get through these. I know we're running out of time and I want to respect people's time, so we'll go through them quickly. Anna asked, which part of the past should we be looking at in terms of our stories? A great question. Dental school, both academic and clinical, maybe just clinical itself, personal life, work experience. Yeah. These are the go-tos. And what I will say is most of the time in the dental school interview, if you're unsure, better to go dental. And if you're desperate, then you can have some maybe work experiences, other kind of work experiences. My least favorite would be personal, especially when they're asking something that should be a professional setting. So let's say they ask you something like, tell us about a conflict that you dealt with. Well, the last thing I want to hear as an interviewer, which I've actually heard before, is, oh, my wife and I, or my husband and I got into an argument and, we had to go get counseling. So I've heard some crazy stuff before. And that's not that situation is crazy. It's just that it's not appropriate for an interview. Or just, I've had a friend and she was mean to me and she told me and now it becomes it feels more dramatic. It feels like makes me as an interviewer wonder if you're someone who often has conflicts like this. Is this person more dramatic and maybe they are much more engaged in conflicts than other people? So it brings up more questions when we use the personal one. I would try to stay away from personal as much as I can and go with dental first. And then again, if you absolutely can't think of anything, work experience in another kind of job that maybe is not dental related would be second priority, unless they ask you to specifically talk about something outside of dentistry. Now, sometimes people will say, well, should I talk about dental? Or, some candidates will ask the interviewer to be specific. Oh, did you want something dental or not? And if they do give you guidance there, great. But if they don't, they say, well, it's up to you. Again, I would go with the dental because it's sort of the most challenging and it's the most risky, but it has the most rewards, right? So if you can think of some dental ones, I would come to the interview prepared with dental stories related and maybe a few other work experience ones just to have on the backup. Ned, if our story involves something where we were negligent, for example, forgetting to take a detailed patient history, would that go against our favor even if we were able to rectify it? Okay, well, this is a really good question because there's one example question that I talked about where it might be good to have a story like this, and that is like, when is a time that you've made a mistake? Tell us about a mistake that you've made. So in that case, yes, you were negligent, right? But your particular example of forgetting to take a detailed patient history, it's forgivable, and it's something that I think most dentists could relate to, that they've one time or another forgotten to do this. They were busy, they were stressed, overbooked, all that stuff. So something that we can relate to. And so in this case, you'd want to talk about, you're less the hero here probably, but in this example, you're going to want to talk about how you at least were heroic in solving your own problem. So let's say you created the problem, but you also it's not the solution shouldn't be that someone came and saved your butt. The solution should be that you proactively rectified the situation. And you talked about how we're able to rectify it. That's great. So you want to be really clear about how you rectified it. Mistakes I see people make is that they don't add much of that part, or they don't add that part at all. So they just leave it as a problem. Oh, I forgot to take a patient history. and that's my mistake. Well, what happened, and how did you rectify it? Or at least if you didn't rectify it, how did you make sure it didn't happen again? So you always want to end on a positive results. So just think about that. So even if the mistakes that you've made, what did you do to make things better either next time or even in that situation as best as you could? Shilpa, how do we respond to questions like mistakes? Okay, so I just talked about that, and hopefully that my response just now will relate to that. That's the way to do it. It's a little bit of a different structure where you're not so much the hero, but you still can be heroic in some ways, even if you're the one who caused it. But that's the way to do that. An ethical situation we have involves a U.S. dentist we currently work for who is being unethical to patients and staff. Okay, would that put me in a bad light since I've worked for them for so long? It's a situation where I said something about the unethical actions being done in the office, but nothing was done about it, even if I brought it up respectfully. Well, this is a good question. People are really worried that they're going to be looked at negatively because of issues of loyalty. Well, I wasn't loyal to my dentist or my boss or the office. And remember, you're dealing with most of the people you're going to be dealing with in these interviews are academics. So their level of ethics is going to be probably higher, I'm going to guess. We can all kind of guess, and this should be the case. It doesn't mean it always is, but it should be that academic professors and academic dental professors should be held to a higher level of ethics than those in the private industry. There is a dentist that I interacted with who a few years ago who was I think he was the head of the restoration department at a U.S. dental school, and he was involved in a practice where he didn't sterilize something to the full level that he should have, which was according to the ADA recommendations, and he was fired from the entire school, fired from his position as head, and also fired from the school. He had to go out on his own, and he said to me afterwards, he said, that was a mistake because I should have known that I was held up to that higher level, even though from everything I've done, the research has shown that sterilizing that doesn't really make a huge difference in terms of patient outcomes. He's like, but I get it. I was held to that higher level as an academic, so I have to understand that. And so it's just the school kind of fired him probably to show as an example to other professors, hey, we're at a very high level of ethics. So I think what you can say is you're pretty safe to talk about the situation in the way that you plan to, because what's the highest priority for a lot of academic professors and dentistry is sticking to the book, sticking to the ideal, right? The ideal preps. How often does that really happen in the private world? Not very ideal, right? Not always, but when they teach it because it's about idealism, and so that's a safe place to talk about this. Now, if you were to go to a dental office, then we might be talking about a little different situation. And it depends on how ethical that office was, and you'd have to kind of use your gut to feel whether or not they would like that or not. And I will be clear, there's dental offices that if you were to interview at an office and they asked you about the situation and you brought this up, they probably wouldn't hire you. But then I would ask, is that a bad thing? Maybe not. Maybe it's a kind of, maybe if you were to get hired, you might be saving yourself from getting hired at a place that basically would ask you to do unethical things. So, you're in an academic setting for these interviews. I'm going to say go for it. I hope that helps. And that's also Ned's question. So hopefully that does help. Anna says, keep the drama away. Great. Exactly. Keep the drama away. We don't want to be dramatic people. So a lot of times with problems that come up, it's better if we are not the cause of those problems. And so our problems shouldn't be, even if it's a mistake. Let's say we think about the question, what's the time you made a mistake? The mistake should never be, I created some drama. I created some conflict with people in my office out of nowhere. Yes, that may have been a mistake, but that's not a mistake that looks very good for you. The mistake should always be something kind of like what Ned was saying, something negligent and simple. something that's forgivable. Obviously you don't want to do something that's going to cause major damage to a patient. At the same time, to me, it's just as bad to say, yeah, I got into a fight with my dental assistant because I didn't like her attitude. Well, again, that's showing you, yes, it's a mistake in it, but it's also showing that you're a dramatic person. I shadowed a dental clinic in the U.S. this is viral or viral. I shadowed a dental clinic in the U.S. for a few weeks where the dentist also allowed me to assist him at sometimes. Is it good to mention my dental assistance experience? Also, it could lead to more complications since I'm on a tourist visa. Okay, so this is a question I'm gonna go back to my video. Hopefully you guys can see me. This is a question that's not related to the topic, so let me just make sure we have any other things beforehand. What if we talk about a dentist being unethical? Would it be considered a bad mouthing her or him on that part? I would be careful to describe someone as unethical in your interview. That's sort of a judgment, right? And that's mostly a point of view, a conclusion that you're making. Better to describe the behavior that you saw. Those are the facts. So here's what I saw. I suspected that was unethical. Maybe I'm being asked about an ethical situation. I'm going to infer, without saying it specifically, that was unethical, but I'm not going to maybe say the words like he was unethical or she was unethical. I'm just going to throw the facts out there, let them decide for themselves. Because, yeah, I don't want to be bad-mouthing. That can be, there's a little bit of a gray area where you don't want to necessarily get mean or basically making grand conclusions. I think it's enough just to say what happened and let them kind of put two to two together. Ethical dilemma. Can we give a story? This is from Gabby. Can we give a story where the patient had financial issues and we ended up paying for them to solve the issue? Well, this is a common response to ethical dilemmas. What's interesting is that it could backfire. So think about it. You're thinking, is it ethical? Oh, this person was a poor patient. They didn't have any money, and I helped them by paying for their issue. So I'm doing the right thing, right? So this is the typical way it's described. But let's think about it another way, which is, let's say this is not your practice. This is your boss's practice, and you continue to give away free treatments to people. Well, that could be an ethical issue in itself. Oh, this dentist that we had working here, she kept giving away free treatments to people, and that's why our office went bankrupt or something like that. So right, so that's why we never made our numbers. So that may not always look good to say that, So we want to be careful of assuming that there's always a right way of thinking about ethics. Like, it could be just as good ethically, it could be just as the right thing that you did, just as much as it could be in other cases the wrong thing for the same action you took. Now, if it's your own practice, that's a different story, and that's sort of your own decision. But is it an ethical issue? Not traditionally, not classically. When we think about a classic ethical issue, we're usually talking about somebody who is either doing the wrong thing, like just not something that's going to harm somebody, or we're talking about somebody who is tempting somebody else to do the wrong thing. Again, consequences being someone, maybe a patient gets hurt, maybe company loses money. There's dishonesty involved. Usually think about that. There's often dishonesty involved in these ethical cases. Well, where's the dishonesty? The patient's being honest that they don't have the money, and you're either going to honestly say yes or say no. If you say yes, I'll pay for you, and don't tell your boss, well, that could be dishonest. Now that's an ethical situation. But if you say, no, I can't help you, well, you're being honest. They're being honest. You're not lying to your boss. And so it's actually not an ethical situation yet, because you feel bad for that person, but your policy at the office may be that, we don't do that. We don't give free treatments away. And you're saying that this was an emergency in a community clinic. Okay, well, you can, so that's ramping that up a bit. Now if it's an emergency and they're in absolute pain, possibly I hope that it really is, though, because I have had people say stuff like this, and then when I kind of, again, my job as an interviewer is to probe them on that. Say, okay, well, what was the emergency? Oh, well, and then they're kind of like, and then I can tell that maybe they were just using that to make it sound like a better story. But then when I actually probe them, they didn't really have the details, or the details can seem a little sparse, and hopefully I'm sure it was for you. I'm not saying you were not giving me a real answer, but just make sure that if you're going to use, like, if you're going to make it an emergency, that could be definitely a real situation. Just make sure you have the story really clear in your head so that you don't look like you're just making it up. So that's the one thing I would say with this stuff. And I'm not, by the way, there's times where I've kind of shifted a story, so I'm not saying it's bad to make some of that stuff up. It can be good, but I just say, when you do it, you have to be completely make sure that you have it all fleshed out. You don't want to be like doing this on the spot so much. Best to just kind of use real stories. So that's the tried and true method. It's the one I recommend, because that way, you know, it's the most convincing. It's the most compelling. Like in this case, if it was an emergency, the other thing you could do, though, if you want, is to say something like, it was an emergency, and I knew there was an emergency clinic 2 miles away where they take people that don't have the finances, and so I was able to help, get a taxi for them, or recommend that they go there, and they were able to get the situation taken care of. So that could be another way of addressing it. Hopefully that makes sense, though. And the reason I'm kind of talking about this one a lot is because I always am mixed about this, the financial issue, the patient with a financial issue. It's sort of like for the question of like, what is an ethical situation? It's one of the top 10 responses. Oh, I had a patient that couldn't afford it. Probably every 1 out of every 5 candidates, I'll hear this. And because of all the reasons I just said, it tends to be something that's not surprising. They've heard this before, and if they've already decided that they don't like this question, they're going to just conclude before you're even done that this doesn't count. And they may tell you that, or they may not. And from what I've talked to, a lot of folks kind of have concluded that these are not that great. So again, you really have to make sure it's a unique and special case. But I would recommend finding a better ethical situation, personally. Anna asks, what if an ethical issue was the dentist making it the norm at work for his dental assistant and RDA to do ultrasonic scaling? I see. Would it just altogether be better to use another story? Okay, so that's an interesting one. So you could do this one. The question is, here's the problem about this response. I'm assuming that you are either the dental assistant in this case, or the RDA, registered dental assistant. If you're not great, like if this was back in your home country when you were practicing and you saw this happening to DAs and RDAs, then you have, in that case, you would have more power as a dentist to say, I see you're doing this. This is not ethical. Stop it, or I'm going to something. I'm going to either tell our boss, or if he or she is the boss, I'm going to report you, or I'm going to quit, or something that you're going to basically say, I don't put up with this. The problem with this story is that if you're the DA or RDA yourself, what can you do? You're not the one, you don't have much power, right, in these offices usually. So what are you going to do about this? Well, most time people don't do anything with this. and it's almost like we all know that. So it would be surprising if I were in an interview and I heard this story, and then the person says, well, I told them I was going to report them to, the law, ADA, or I report them to the board or whatever. That would surprise me, because that would be a really gutsy move for a non-dentist who's not the boss, who's doesn't have much power at that office, to just have that guts to do that. Now, it could happen, but it's going to make me as an interviewer very suspicious of, like, okay, let's really probe into this and see if they really do this. What board did you contact? What was their response? I'm going to probe like crazy to try to see if this is a real story, Are you making up the fact that you told the agency, or are you just BSing me to kind of make me satisfied? I'm going to go after, my job as an interviewer is to kind of go after you and try to make sure this is a real story or not. Because my suspicion might be that you do what everyone does, which is to let it go. And so that's what I would say. That's the problem with this story in particular is that if you're in the DA or RDA position, it's going to make that story a lot more scrutinized. So if you're going to use the story, again, you might think about doing it in your home country. That way you have a little more protection. They don't maybe know as much about your home country and how things work there. They don't really, you put yourself in a position of power. You're more of a colleague to this person, or you just are you're right underneath them and you have a lot of power. You're above other people. So there's more a stake for them, and that becomes a little better of a story that they can't really poke as many holes in. So hopefully that gives you an idea. And this is a good example because this is the way I think about good stories. I don't just throw any story out there. I really strategize and start to think about, okay, for me as an interviewer, I think like, what are the possible ways they could poke holes in my story? I think about this every time. And that's probably something I should put in the slides is whenever you come up with your story, I want you to attack it the way I'm doing with these stories, right? I want you to pretend you're the interviewer, and I want you to think, is this real? And if it's not real, what question can I ask to test to see if it's real or not? And my hope is to catch them. If you can do that to your own story, that might help you create the narrative a little better and a little stronger so that you can justify the story and they can't poke the holes in it that they'd like to. And or you just choose this is not a good story, or I need to change the location or change some of the core facts. So great. I'm really glad you asked that, Anna, because it really, and also Gabby, both of those really help us to kind of learn more about, okay, well, great. We've chosen a story, but is this story open for scrutiny? And if it is, let's see how we can adjust the story or choose a different one. So fantastic. All right, great. Well, hopefully that was helpful to everybody. I always enjoy these question aspects. I always think they're the most fun of the workshop. So I appreciate you guys staying behind and listening. If you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out to us at mail@internationaldentistcentral.com, and we'll be happy to get back to you that way. Otherwise, we wish you the best this season. I wish you the best in your interviews this season for those of you who have it. And if you don't have one yet, I'm going to be crossing my fingers for you guys that you get one, in the next little bit, and you get some great interview invitations this year. So really appreciate you guys coming out and spending the time. That this is precious time, I know, everyone. And so I really commend you guys for coming out tonight and doing that for a live workshop. Have a great night, and thanks again. Take care.